a man, who they say he murdered 3. Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
I'm your host, Chris James. Water is the most vital substance on the planet. Good, clean water, which lately has been in short supply here in Laredo. Somebody let the nasty goo from the outgoing pipes into the incoming pipes. Our water was so bad, many restaurants were no longer serving sweet tea. Good thing coffee was still available. Without good clean water, coffee tastes kind of weird, like drinking out of a sewer pipe. Without good clean water, coffee is just brown water. It's like drinking something that should be flushed. To fix the problem, the city dumped massive amounts of chlorine into our drinking supply. You could wash the whites without using any bleach. Once again, it made the coffee taste funny. Fortunately, my wife and I have a massive filtering system on our house, so we were able to use the water to bathe in and use a lot of bottled water. Good clean water is necessary to make good coffee. The Organic Man coffee trike only has the best coffee on the planet. If you want to drink only the best, go to 4501 McPherson and find out what life is really all about. If it's just too far to drive or fly, check out organicmancoffeetrike.shop. It keeps the werewolves away. Werewolves. Still think that sounds like Terry Garr. In honor of the season, I decided to do a show about our local college, which used to be an army fort. I did a show in August 2019, and it's been a while, so here is a follow-up, kind of like a second part. I'll try to add nothing but new things to the show and just not redo the old stuff, but some of the stories I have to repeat because they are good, and also I couldn't find that much new stuff. The folks who are new to my show, you might want to go back and check out the past shows. You can find all of the archives on iHeartRadio in the podcast section. Fort McIntosh was established in 1849 when troops from Camp Ringgold were marched north to set up a military presence in Webb County. The soldiers were occupying a field at the bend of the Rio Grande west of town. In 1853, orders came to put together an actual fort. There was nothing to build with, so they just piled up dirt in the shape of a star fort. When the wind blew, the walls went away and had to be rebuilt whenever the weather got better. They tried to plant grass to hold the walls together, but the dirt was in too bad a shape for anything to grow, even with constant watering. There were no buildings. Everybody lived in a tent. It was super hot even at night, and most of the troops wanted to leave and to never come back. Laredo was considered the worst posting in the military. The men stationed here were mounted infantry. They were trained to ride into the fighting and then dismount whenever they're actually going to be engaging. Typical of those in the rear with the gear, the fort only had a few horses to be used by the officers. As time marched on, Washington finally got around to shipping in some wood so they could build barracks and officers' quarters and corrals and a mess hall. As soon as the inner part of the fort were finished, the troops were all shipped off to Florida to put down the Seminole uprising. The Indians kind of objected to people moving in and taking everything they had. Like a bad neighbor, the settlers were there. By 1857, Fort McIntosh only had a few men, so the government sold off the buildings so the people in and around Laredo could use the wood for their own construction projects. The few men still here were shipped to other locations, and the fort was left to the elements. Some of the Indians who had been displaced from Florida moved into Mexico right across the river from Eagle Pass. The folks living there got worried as more Indians were being seen just over the river. The government was asked to put Fort McIntosh back into use. Troops were sent to reestablish the now unusable fort. Tents were set back up once again because all the buildings were gone. They had to pile the dirt back up to try to make it look like a star fort. Anytime bandits or hostile Indians attacked any town or ranch in the area, word had to be sent to the fort. The troops now had to march to the area of the attack, arriving days or even weeks after they had been needed. The whole idea of the cavalry riding to the rescue was not to be had anywhere around Fort McIntosh. Just before the Great War, the war to end all wars, aka World War I, the fort was once again abandoned, with the troops being moved a few hundred yards south to an open field where they had originally started. This time, buildings were put up to give the men a place to call home. They started with wooden buildings and eventually they put up several brick facade barracks and offices. 1917, the soldiers had all been sent to fight in France or Belgium. The bad guys roaming about Mexico thought that the fort was now empty. They were somewhat surprised to discover that the New Hampshire National Guard were occupying the place. There were a few battles fought within the fort as bandits from Mexico tried moving in to steal anything they could find. For reasons only known to the higher ups, no official records were kept on these attacks. A private from New Hampshire was an avid letter writer. He told of many small skirmishes involving bandits who were surprisingly dressed in Mexican military uniforms. Fortunately, his family bundled up all of his letters and sent them to the Laredo Library, where Renee dug them out and let me read them. If you can't read cursive writing, you're going to be out of luck in a situation like that. Germany was actively trying to get Mexico to attack Texas to keep the U.S. out of Europe. Men dressed in uniforms were captured only to be allowed to return to their home country. This was happening from Zapata to Eagle Pass. Just before the U.S. got drawn into World War II, the walls around Fort McIntosh were finally built. It was finished a few months after after Pearl Harbor attack. From the time the troops from Camp Ringgold arrived until 1945, when the fort was actually closed for good, many folks died there, both men and women. Some were accidents, others were killed by their fellow troops. Suicides were not unheard of. Prisoners were kept in many of the guardhouses. People from Germany, Japan, and Mexico, as well as Indians who were accused of doing things the government was actually doing to them. Prisoners would escape on occasion and wind up being shot. One of the first stories I heard once arriving in Laredo was of Satanists performing bizarre rituals in the area where the old tennis courts sat. This was just west of the Allied Health buildings and east of the motor pool. At the time, there was nothing there except the rundown courts and a couple of old warehouses. If you go to the Allied Health buildings today and you look at the way the buildings are designed, you might go, why do they look like old warehouses? Well, they were designed to keep the looks of the old fort. So they had to be built to look like old warehouses. Students at the college would drive around the area to see what might be seen. A couple of women were passing the warehouses when a huge black dog appeared out of nowhere and began chasing them. The driver hit the gas, but the dog managed to stay with them until they had cleared the area. While working upriver, we would sneak into that area on occasion to see if we could catch anything weird. It was dark and the buildings were in very bad shape. There was a gate, more like just an opening in the wall, leading to the neighborhood south of the fort. This was not a very good place either. Some of the folks living there were doing their best, while others were deep into drug smuggling and crime. The gravel pit was just a few blocks farther south from the gate. Agents working the pit would hear voices. They would see shapes that kind of looked like people, only it was only their shadows. And on occasion, several agents told me they felt an invisible hand grab their arm. Most agents working the pit would stay along the edges in the neighborhood, drive back and forth, and try to catch whoever was coming out, waiting for the bad guys to come to them. Those of us who enjoyed the bizarre things in life would walk the trails in the middle of the night, in the dark with no light. Your flashlight was there only if you needed it. It was kind of like being in your own private personal horror movie that you hoped you would survive. You might hear someone moving about in the brush around you. If you tried to catch them, you would only find there was nobody there and there was no indication anybody ever had been. You'd hear them walking through the brush, but when you looked, there were no footprints. A couple of guys from Laredo drove into the pit late one night only to encounter the Satanists. They had moved from the tennis courts into the pit. There were 15 to 20 people in full length dark robes standing around a bonfire. They all had their hands up in the air, chanting. The two guys decided it was best to get the heck out of there and fast. On a few occasions, we would find a dead body in the pit. Back then, any questionable deaths were shipped to San Antonio because we didn't have a medical examiner. The folks up north weren't too concerned with getting to the bottom of things, and most deaths were written off as unknown causes, even when what looked like a bullet hole was visible. The military buildings mostly fell down or were torn down over time and were replaced with modern structures that were more usable for the junior college. Arechiga Hall is the only survivor of the three buildings that were put up before World War I. It is a two-story building with a huge basement and attic. Folks working there hear someone or something moving around in the attic. Martha was a student a few years ago. She worked for the college to help pay her bills. Her desk was right in front of the stairs going up to the attic. Anyone coming from the first floor would have to pass right in front of her. If they went up to the attic, her or one of her fellow workers would see them. On many occasions, they would hear footsteps moving around overhead. You can tell the difference between wood creaking from age and somebody walking. They would ask each other, did anybody go upstairs? To which the answer was always no. Having to know what was going on, as a group, the students would walk slowly up the stairs to the top of the building. It was hot and dusty and empty. Once back at their desks, they would once again hear steps moving back and forth over their heads. Shadow beings, or simply black shapes, were seen in the hallways. This happened often enough that most people had either seen them or they knew someone that had. During an LPRS investigation, a group of people were followed from the second floor by a black shadow. Everybody stayed calm because it wasn't a TV show, and they got out of there quickly. Had this been on one of the reality shows, somebody would have yelled and they'd have all gone running down the stairs like madmen and madwomen. We had an SLS camera set up in the main room. It was hooked to a big TV so everybody could see the images projected by the computer. Humanoid shapes would be shown standing next to some of the students or investigators. An SLS camera sends out hundreds of infrared beams. The beams build a 3D model of the area and everything in it. Using advanced human shapes and skeletal tracking, it will recognize people and ghosts, which you can see on the screen. They look like little stick figures. I had one possible ghost standing right next to me, so, me being me, I tried tickling it. I don't know if it worked, but the image on the screen moved around a bunch and then it vanished. Can ghosts be tickled? Maybe, or maybe I was just annoying it. Maybe it didn't want me touching it and it was trying to get away and it only looked like it was having a good time. Ishmael likes to have photographs of all of the people participating in guest events. These are just for our records. While investigating Arachiga Hall, he got the guests to stand under the painting of the first president of the college, the man the hall is named for. Ishmael took the photos as each tour ended, asking if those people involved had had a good time, if anybody had seen or heard anything. A lot of photos had been taken, and we had a bunch of videos and EMF recordings to go through. One of the guest photos got our attention. There are 16 students standing underneath the painting. There's a hallway behind several of them leading to the back doors. At the end of the hall is a shape, maybe 4.5 feet tall, standing in the corner. Zooming in on this being, you can see right through them. Just a human shaped shadow with no one and nothing to cast it. During a few EMF sessions, a spirit had identified themselves as being about 8 years old. The Fort Hospital used to be at the main entrance, just west of the bridge. It is the first big 2-story building on the right. Untold numbers of soldiers and their families went there to have small wounds stitched up and major injuries fixed. Some never made it out alive. The morgue was in the basement. Once the military had moved out, the building was used as the Border Patrol headquarters for many years. When the BP moved to Del Mar, the building became a dance studio for a while. One instructor told me about his students that had gone downstairs in order to retrieve some equipment. They came running back up saying there was something down there. He went to have a look. There had been dozens of photographs hanging along the walls. They'd been there earlier that day. All the photos had been taken down and placed facing the walls along the very bottom. Others said they always heard something moving around in the dark, just out of sight. Once I was in Laredo, I had taken several classes at Laredo Junior College, which then became Laredo Community College, and now they just call it Laredo College. Most of us still refer to it as either LJC or LCC. Calling it LC is just kind of not that wow. I got to know the folks on the campus police department. I also got to know several of the professors as well as the cleaning staff. Campus police were called to investigate the sounds of dogs fighting inside the old hospital one night. As the officers drove up, they could hear what sounded like a war going on. Barking and growling and yelping, all coming from inside the building. The first thing they did was walk around the building to try and figure out how the dogs might have gotten inside. All the doors and windows were secured. This led to them having to go inside. They unlocked the front door and pushed it open. As the door swung in, the sounds all stopped. It was as quiet as a tomb. The officers stepped in and began searching. They found no dogs, no dog hair. None of the furniture had been upset. There was nothing to show had been any creatures inside or what might have happened to them. When I checked the records, as far back as I could find, I could never find any stories of dogs having been kept inside. Joe worked at the Fort campus doing air quality studies. He had a trailer filled with equipment that needed to be checked and maintained. The station was enclosed by a high fence with razor wire. The equipment was expensive and the place wasn't manned all the time. On several occasions, he would hear somebody coming into the trailer only to discover there was nobody around. He also heard gunshots on a few occasions coming from outside. He began carrying a recording device so he could capture these sounds. One night, while trying some EVPs at the old cemetery, Joe and his assistant asked all the usual questions, followed by a lot of silence. To be successful, you have to be patient. You have to hold still. Make sure there is little to no background noise. Pause between questions to allow answers to be given. It's a very good idea to set the recording device down so you don't accidentally move it around and cause sounds to be made. During the questions, you don't hear anything, but you just sit there and keep asking them. Once they were back in his truck, they played the recorder to see if they had caught anything. When they asked who was around, they heard a disembodied voice answer, saying he was Lieutenant. This was followed by unintelligible sound. They had gotten a fairly good, easy to understand answer. It wasn't like you had to run it through a filter to understand what was being said. The word lieutenant was very clear. It was the name that was a bit garbled. A lieutenant had been killed while out on patrol from the fort many years ago, back when they had one or two horses. Perhaps it was him. I have heard from several people that they have spotted a woman walking, well, not really walking, drifting along the west end of the college. She is dressed in an old style white outfit, high collared, full length dress. She has long black hair that hangs down past her waist. Paulina saw this woman while walking along Taylor Street. This spirit was moving north across and into the staff housing area. This entity had been moving along Ainsworth Drive, also has been seen on Ainsworth Drive, always going in the same direction. A few people say she was in the backyards of the buildings, while others say that she was walking along the road. She moves around a lot, but she's always seen in the same general area, and she's always walking north. The baseball team was wrapping up for the evening when they saw this woman as well. Her dress was almost to the ground, but they could see that she wasn't actually touching it. BP agents working at the water treatment plant, maybe we should come up with a different name for it since they don't seem to be treating our water. That building on Riverbank Drive that smells like poo and chlorine. Agents have seen this woman along the banks of the river around that building, walking along the trails next to the river. She doesn't look around as she moves. She just keeps drifting in a northerly direction, heading to someplace else. Frank worked at the Laredo Children's Museum, which had been put into the old chapel many years ago. It was at the far west side of the Laredo Community College, or was it the junior college? It was back a ways. The museum used to be the Fort McIntosh chapel that had been built during World War II. He often felt as if someone was watching him any time he was there alone. As he moved about the building, he would suddenly look over his shoulder to see who was there, but he never saw anyone. The building has a basement, which is unusual for Laredo. The offices for the museum were located there. When closing up for the night, Frank would have to turn out all the lights in the building and then make his way through the dark so he could exit. One night, as he exited the old chapel, walked across the street to get to his car, the alarm in the building suddenly went off. He quickly returned to the museum so he could check and see if anything was amiss, and he also had to reset the alarm. He had to walk through the dark, empty museum, moving through the 1940s structure, looking for any reason for the alarm. When nothing appeared to be out of place, he reset the alarm and headed back to his car. Once at his vehicle, the alarm went off again. Frank went back into the museum, once more checking the cause of the alarm and resetting the system so he could leave. Getting back to his car, he was not that surprised by the sound of the alarm going off. He walked back across the street, up the stairs, into the darkened building. A quick check showed no signs of any disturbance. As Frank walked back to the exit, the sound of something crashing to the floor near the back of the museum did catch him by surprise. Nothing should have or could have made so much noise. Having had enough, Frank got in his car and got out of there. The campus police could handle the next alarm should it go off again. The next day he returned to work. Frank asked the day shift if they had found anything in the museum that might have caused all the commotion. They told him there was nothing out of place and there was nothing laying on the floor. In October, we were doing guest events at the college. This was a time to get the new folks some training while teaching students some things about ghosts and spirits. One of our investigators was walking around the second floor, snapping photographs as he went. There was nothing to report until he looked at his images. On one photo of the front door, you can see what looks like a woman standing to the right side of the door. Zooming in, you can see the frame through her body. There had been nobody else around when that photo was taken. During the guest event, a bunch of students followed a pair of investigators down to the basement. They all stepped into one of the rooms when one of the students said he felt something burning along his back. Lifting his shirt, there were 6 scratches running up and down. The student was taken to the main room to be checked out and have a few photos taken. Hal tried to figure out how these scratches had been made. The only way would be the student would have had to have moved up and down a foot or so while in full view of everybody standing against something sharp enough to get to his skin through his jacket. We all figured that this was the end of the tours because you're not supposed to get students injured while teaching them. Instead, the number of requests to take the tours tripled. We did far more events than we had originally planned. Once more, back to the ball field. The field is right next to the old cemetery. The soldiers buried there were supposed to have all been removed to Fort Sam, but stories abound of bodies not having made the trip. The ball team was warming up to get some practice in when one of the players spotted a body hanging from a tree right next to the cemetery wall. He yelled and pointed out this sight. Everyone turned and looked. Somebody must have hung themselves just moments ago. There hadn't been anything there when they had all arrived. Everyone ran to try to assist. They were panicking, not sure what to do, but they were going to try doing something. One of them grabbed his cell phone and was trying to call 911. He was running and hitting buttons, and he was unable to get the number that he needed. As the ball team all got closer to the tree, the body was no longer there. It had vanished right in front of them. They all checked the trees in the area just in case, but they never found anyone or anything that looked like a body, let alone an actual body. One of the staff was about to head home. She closed the door to her office only to realize that she'd left her purse sitting on her desk. As she was about to open the door, she glanced in through the window. A man was sitting behind her desk. She stood there staring at this figure when he looked up. He got to his feet and he began walking towards her. She turned and ran, thinking this person had somehow broken into her office. She hoofed it out to the police station, which was right across the street. The officer ran to the office and looked in. The door was still locked, so he had to get the key from her and open it up. There was no one there. He questioned the professor on what this guy had looked like. He was dressed in what looked like a khaki uniform. He was wearing a necktie that was tucked into the front of his shirt. The man she had seen sounded exactly like a soldier from World War II. It had seemed as if he was as surprised seeing her as she was seeing him. I simply have to talk about Sophie. Her story has been told a few times, and I always get a kick out of telling it again. I hope she's listening. The guest events were open to students, staff, and their families. Sophie's mom worked at the college. Sophie showed up every night to go on a ghost hunt. She is really into ghosts. Her mom told me that she will ask for ghost hunting gear for her birthday as well as Christmas. The second night of the Great October investigation was at the guardhouse. In the Army, the guardhouse is the jail. You could work out of the guardhouse, or you could be locked up in it, depending. There were two big rooms for several prisoners. There was a main room for the guards, and three small isolation cells. Over the years, Fort McIntosh has had several guardhouses located in different parts of the installation. I have one old map that shows 6 different guardhouses. The big room wasn't that big. Several students were going to check things out. Sophie was through the door first. I stood outside on the porch because there wasn't enough room for all of us. They all moved about in the dark room. Someone kicked a bottle across the floor. This elicited a scream from someone. The scream got everybody panicking, and they all ran from the room. The students ran out the door, across the porch, across the street, and into the parking lot. Once there, everybody stood around trying to catch their breath and regain their dignity. I stuck my head around the edge of the door and looked into the room. There she stood, all by herself. Sophie was standing there. She had an EMF detector in one hand and a recorder in the other. The students had all run off and left her. She told me that she was there to find ghosts, and the others, they were just there. I dedicated the book, Fort McIntosh and the Paranormal, to Sophie, the future of ghost hunting. That same night, Ishmael set up the Mel meter in the central room. The Mel 8704 was designed and built by Gary Galka. His eldest daughter, Melissa, was born in 1987, and she died in 2004. This is why it is the 8704. After her death, she began making contact with her family, so Gary put this meter together to make communications easier. The meter is a dual-purpose unit that measures both EMF and temperature changes simultaneously. The students all gathered around to watch and listen as Ishmael asked for any spirits to make their presence known. Being a jail, Ishmael asked if any of the spirits had been prisoners here. He asked in both English and Spanish. Being in an American fort, would there have been Spanish-speaking prisoners kept here? June 16th, 1916, a band of 100 Mexican soldiers from either the Carrancistas or the Sedetistas. I can't say the word right now. Seditionists is the word, but in Spanish. They decided to attack a small military post in San Ignacio, Texas. What they didn't know, there was a large detachment of soldiers moving from Fort McIntosh en route to Fort Ringgold, formerly Camp Ringgold. They had stopped to spend the night in San Ignacio, a short distance from the old fort there. As the Mexican soldiers crossed the river, they were met by a superior force. During the skirmish, many men were killed. 3 American soldiers and 6 Mexican soldiers were dead, and several from both sides were seriously injured. As daylight came over the small town, the United States soldiers had managed to capture several of their attackers. The prisoners were transported back to Fort McIntosh. Once on the fort grounds, Texas Rangers were called to come take them from the fort to the Webb County Jail. One of the wounded soldiers from Fort McIntosh died the next day, and this was why District Attorney decided that he was going to prosecute the Mexican soldiers in Webb County, even though the raid had been in Zapata County. The invaders were found guilty of murder. As they awaited execution, an appeals court stepped in and they declared the prisoners could not be tried in a state court because Texas was at war with Mexico, and therefore the prisoners had to face a military trial. The entire company that had faced the invaders had been shipped off to Fort Bliss in El Paso, and so none of the witnesses were called to testify during the appeals trial. The Texas Rangers turned the prisoners over to Colonel Ferguson at Fort McIntosh. After a few weeks of debate, the military said that the United States was not at war with Mexico, and therefore Texas was not at war either. The prisoners were released back to Nuevo Laredo, where they received a hero's welcome. The reports on the raid vary from a few dozen bandits up to 100. Some said they were constitutionalists from General Alfredo Ricaurte's army, who adamantly denied that this was possible. He said that he did not allow his soldiers to conduct bandit activity. The story is so often stated that it could be true, but we don't know. We weren't there. Ishmael asking the spirits in Spanish was very appropriate. The meter would give off a high-pitched sound after each question. The questions were all yes or no answers, and the spirit was asked to make one sound for yes and two for no. As Ishmael was asking the questions, suddenly the meter jumped from a large wooden box that it had been resting on, and it fell to the floor at his feet. The family of General Haynes had loaned the LPRS a cigarette lighter from the 1900s. It was a very fancy and very valuable. Troops smoked. At one time, smoking was considered to be good for you. When I was at Fort Knox, a carton of cigarettes cost $4.50. At one time, you would get cigarettes in C-ration packages. Just about everybody in the military smoked. Even though it looked like it was a watch, it was actually a fancy cigarette lighter that had been loaned from General Haynes' family. The fancy cigarette lighter was placed on the wooden box along with a few cigarettes. We also would step outside once in a while and take a sniff of the air to see if we could catch the smell of tobacco. While Ishmael was asking the questions and watching the EMF detector, the device suddenly fell off the wooden box. Nobody had been close enough to knock the device over, let alone get it over the side and onto the floor. There were several students standing there with video cameras, but unfortunately, when all three of them were looking around the room instead of right at the EMF detector, that was when it went off. I talked about the little girl last week. She is the best known spirit in all of Laredo, but I won't go into her tonight, even though She is also one of my favorite subjects to talk about. The Kaizen Center is where the students can gather to study or relax. The cafeteria is there as well as the bookstore. There are offices all along the perimeter. Students work in these offices to help pay their bills and to get a bit of experience. One student was sitting at her desk when she saw the reflection of someone passing right behind her in the glass door that she was facing. She turned to see who it was, but she didn't see anyone there. She went to see if maybe they had stepped into one of the offices. Opening the first door, the lights came on automatically. The next room and the one after that all had the same sensor, and no one was there. Later, she found out that other people who were also working that same area would see a person walking behind them reflected in the glass when there was no one there. The cleaning staff were working this same area. They opened the door to one of the rooms and they were met by the sound of a large animal growling at them. One of them got down on the floor and tried looking under the desk to see where this beast might be hiding. He didn't see anything. They tried to step into the room once more, and they were met with this vicious animal sounds. They decided that the room was quite thoroughly clean enough, and they left. They also would hear somebody in the men's bathroom just below this section of the building. They hear somebody walking around, and they hear doors open and close, and the water comes on. They look inside, and there's never anybody there. While sitting in the break room at the far end of the hall, Daniel saw the reflection of a man walking through the room right behind him. The man in the reflection was wearing a yellow shirt and khaki pants. Turning to see who was there in the room with him, Daniel saw there was no one there. He was in the glass, just not in the room. On the second floor is a room that was set up to look like a little museum. Mostly it had a whole bunch of photographs from the past, and there were a few items of interest you could look at. One of the students was looking around the room when it suddenly became super hot, like somebody had just opened a door to an oven. This was immediately followed by the room becoming extremely cold. It went from one extreme to the other in a matter of seconds. She felt some kind of a force pushing down on her shoulders and pushing her onto the floor. She became so frightened that this might just be the end. She managed to flip onto her stomach and get her knees up under her, get to her feet, and run from the room as fast as she could. Once she was just outside the door, everything was back to normal. There was no sign of anything having taken place in the room. I arrived in Laredo in 1988. Our class more than tripled the manpower at Laredo South Station. We were assigned everything from Laredo Junior College south to Zapata, but we seldom got down that far. For years, I heard about a photograph taken by a Border Patrol agent who was driving through Laredo Junior College. The photo showed what looked like a woman and four children standing outside one of the old officers' barracks built back in 1940s. The agent was just driving along late at night and he took the photos of the building. At the time, there was nobody there. Over the years, I have asked agents I know if they had a copy of these photos, and people would tell me that they'd seen the images, but they didn't have a copy of them. I had other things to do than look for a bunch of photos, so I kind of lost interest in it. When I was writing the book, Fort McIntosh and the Paranormal, I got to thinking about these images again, and I went in search of. I asked all the agents I could if they had a copy or knew somebody who did. Everybody said no. I began emailing agents that I didn't know to see if maybe they had a copy of the photos. I got the same reaction. They'd all heard of the photos, but none of them had the photos. I visited the police station at the campus. One of the officers told me that he had a copy. He just didn't know where it was. It was somewhere in the vast pile of files that they had in the back room. He promised he would have a look, but he never had time to do so. You have to work. That's what people pay you for, and they don't expect you to be off doing fool's errands on their time. I was simply going to leave the photo out altogether. I met with Ishmael for some reason. I don't remember what we were discussing, and I just happened to mention to him that I had not been able to find a copy of that photo. He told me not only did he have a copy, but he knew right where it was. He went home and he sent me the copy within a matter of minutes. Now I have the copy of the photo that I had been looking for about 15 years. The first image shows the east side of the officer's dorm. If you look closely, you'll see some hazy shapes that look like people to the left of the photo, between a sign and the front of the building. The next photo shows the front of the building. The agent did not see anyone there. It was only after the photo had been developed that these images showed up. Back in the 1990s, Eddie was at the Laredo Junior College playing basketball. The game was over and everybody was packing up to leave. He stood there talking to the coach about things that did not involve bouncing a ball. An elderly couple began walking right across the court. They were dressed in clothes that looked a bit old fashioned, but people do dress the way they wish. The coach looked at the pair and asked if he could help them since the building was not open to the public at the time. The couple never acknowledged his question. Eddie and the coach both looked at the couple, wondering if there might be some kind of a problem. Maybe they didn't hear the question. The couple approached the wall without slowing down. Then, as they stood there watching, the couple walked right through the wall and vanished. What could you say other than that's weird? Eddie and the coach both left the ball court. A couple of students were playing Pokemon Go. I don't know anything about the game, but I do know that you walk around a lot. One of the game things was shown to be just ahead, and the participant walked in the direction indicated. She walked in through the gate to the cemetery and stopped. There were men in uniform lined up along both sides of the walkway. She thought she had accidentally wandered into some kind of a military ceremony. She carefully backed out. It dawned on her it was late at night and the army was no longer here and the cemetery was no longer in use. My cat wants to be on the show. She looked back into the former graveyard and it was empty. All the soldiers had simply vanished. I was interviewed for the local news a few weeks ago. We were just outside the cemetery gates, and I talked about what I knew about the fort turned college. Alex asked me what part of the college was good location if somebody wanted to see something paranormal. The place to look is the streets around the campus. There are dozens of sightings and audio experiences inside the buildings, but most encounters have been reported outside. People have seen the little girl in just about every part of the campus, not to mention the entire city. The woman in white is seen moving to the north, is reported in dozens of people all along the west side of the campus. The trouble with looking for ghosts is they don't always look like what Hollywood has convinced people that they do. Luciano Guajardo said, "How do you know that person you see sitting at a bus stop isn't there only as you pass, vanishing once you're no longer looking?" I've had many reports of people seeing a person vanish as they're looking at them. The ghost my wife and I both saw looked as real and solid as anyone until he was no longer there. I hate it when Halloween is over. All the candy has been handed out and the lights are turned off in the jack-o'-lanterns. All the good movies are no longer on TV and it's time to gear up for Thanksgiving. Then they announced The Curse of Oak Island is coming back to TV. It will be here the first week of November. Now I'm torn between dreading the end of Halloween and really looking forward to the beginning of the new season. I watch every episode of Curse of Oak Island, even the reruns. I really like that show. I don't know if I want them to ever actually find the treasure. The trouble is, they've invested millions of dollars, and it would be nice to see them get something for their efforts. But once they find it, no matter what it is, that's the end of the mystery. So far this month, I've only seen one good scary movie, Ghost Ship, and I've seen it a dozen times. Once at the theater when it first came out. Where are all the cool horror movies? A lot of the podcasts I listen to are on break right now. Vic is doing his show, plus Paranormal Rundown. Avalon Leanne Dankworth Smythe has been saying all kinds of bad things about him. I wonder what her and Annabelle Lee have to say about each other. That would make an interesting podcast. Just the two of them discussing the paranormal. Get those two their own show. It might lead to the overthrow of the podcast world. It's time to start soliciting stories from my listeners once again. My sixth book is only about half done, and I need some good or maybe some mediocre stories to fill the pages with. If you have had or heard a paranormal story, be it UFO, Bigfoot, cryptid, just unexplainable. It can be from your family or a friend, or it can even be something you overheard while eavesdropping at a restaurant. Send it to me and I'll put it in print. You can send me your stories at strangethings at arcanasa.com. Arcanasa is spelled ARCANASA. A lot of people like to say that Bigfoot is not paranormal. There are other people that will say UFOs are not paranormal. They all seem to think that ghosts are the only thing that qualifies as paranormal these days. Number 130. 130. If you don't know what that means, which I'll bet most of y'all don't, way back when I was young, before the computer age, if you went to the library and you wanted to look for a book on witchcraft, ghosts, UFOs, Bigfoot, unexplained phenomena, crop circles, fish falling from the skies, alien abductions, anything out of the ordinary, you would use the card catalog called the Dewey Decimal System. For anything weird, you would look under section 130, the paranormal section of the Dewey Decimal catalogs. So if Dewey has decided that UFOs and Bigfoot and witchcraft and ghosts and spirits and crop circles are all paranormal, that's good enough for me. Until next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man who they say he murdered 3? Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.